Everybody, this is Mr. Peoples again, and today we're going to be talking about the Civil War, and we're going to get into our first section of the Civil War chapter. This first section is titled The War Begins, so we're going to talk, as you can see on the learning targets there, we're going to talk about the North and South advantages before the war. So when we come out of this, you should be able to tell me what the North advantages were and what the South advantages were. You should be able to describe the North strategy and the South strategy for winning the war. You should be able to identify a major battle and the winner of that battle in this section, and then be able to explain the importance of some people from the Civil War. So there's going to be a couple names that you need to remember from this section. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that what you need to put in your notes are the things that are in blue. So if you remember, blue you do, and then you can, if you need to pause it, if I'm moving too fast, you can always pause the video and jot down what you need from there. All right, let's get started. Okay, now Abraham Lincoln, where we left off, Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, but he doesn't officially take office until March of 1861. And when he takes office, there were southern states that believed that he was going to make them give up their slaves, which they considered their property. So there were 7 southern states that left the Union. They said, we don't want to be a part of the United States of America anymore. We want to make our own country. We're going to call it the Confederate States of America. So they did this even before President Lincoln took office. Those 7 southern states were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These 7 states are the 7 most southern states in the United States there on the eastern side, the southeast side of the United States. Now, when they seceded from the Union and created their own country called the Confederate States of America, they named Jefferson Davis, the man you see pictured here, as the president of the Confederate States of America. Now, President Lincoln did his best to try and keep the Confederates in the Union. When he went up and gave his first speech as president, he told them that he would not attack them unless they were the aggressors. He also said that they weren't enemies, that they were friends, and that they needed to remember about their fathers and grandfathers who fought in the Revolutionary War together, and that hopefully they would their smarts would take over and there wouldn't be a war between the two. But that didn't work. Abraham Lincoln was unsuccessful in trying to get those states to come back. That leads us to Fort Sumter. Now, when the Confederate States left the Union, they also took with them, they took over all of the Union forts that were in the South. They took over all of the places where the Union made weapons. They took over all of the places where the Union made money. And so they took over all of these things. But there was one fort located in Charleston, South Carolina, that had not been given up to the Confederates. And this particular fort was being manned by a man named Major Anderson, Major Robert Anderson. And Major Anderson didn't know what to do. He had pulled all of his soldiers into the fort and was waiting for President Lincoln to give him orders. Now, this fort was designed to protect the city of Charleston, South Carolina. And the Confederates had taken all of the forts on the outside of Fort Sumter, and they asked for Fort Sumter to surrender. Major Anderson asks President Lincoln, what should he do? President Lincoln does not allow Major Anderson to surrender that fort. He tells them that they need to hold out. Major Anderson then tells President Lincoln that we need food. We're running out of food. We can't stay in here this long without food. Please help resupply us. So Lincoln had a decision to make. Does he allow his soldiers to fight against the Southerners that are surrounding the fort? Or does he resupply the fort? What does he do? And so Lincoln decides, and it's actually quite smart what he did, is he made a situation where the South had to make the decision, and the South had to decide if they were going to go to war. So Lincoln decides to send supplies to Fort Sumter by ship. It takes a couple weeks for those ships to get there, and that gives the Confederates some time to think about what they're going to do. Now, the Confederates knew that if they wanted to take this fort, they had to do it before those supply ships arrived. Otherwise, it would be difficult for them to take it. So they decided that now was the chance. Now was their time. So they, on April 12th, 1861, they gave one more opportunity for Major Anderson to surrender. He refuses. And then on April 12th, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate cannons begin firing on Fort Sumter. The commander in charge of this for the Confederates is the guy you see pictured there, Pierre Gustave Dutant Beauregard, PGT Beauregard. And for 34 hours, Fort Sumter was bombed by Confederate cannon. Eventually, the soldiers inside ran out of ammunition, ran out of supplies, and 34 hours later, Fort Sumter was surrendered to the South. So in this first major battle, the South wins, and they gain control of the fort called Fort Sumter. Major Anderson, a couple ironic things here. Major Anderson, when he was an instructor at West Point, which is the military academy for the United States, when he was an instructor at West Point, there was a student that was such a good student, he asked this student to stay with him and teach with him for a couple of years. Well, the student that he asked to stay with him was the guy you see pictured here, and the general for the South, Pierre Gustave Dutant Beauregard. So, in effect, the student in this battle was attacking the teacher and defeated the teacher in this particular battle. Another ironic thing about this first battle is that the Civil War is considered the deadliest war in American history. But ironically, this first major battle, there wasn't one casualty, not one person killed, wounded, missing, or captured. And that's because, I don't know why that is, but what ends up happening, the only casualty in this particular battle is a Confederate horse that was injured while a cannon backfired. So kind of ironic that this bloodiest war in American history, the first battle, doesn't really have many casualties. That will change very quickly as we get into some more of the battles and we talk about them. Okay, let's take a look at what Fort Sumter looks like. First, here's what it looks like on a map of that area. Fort Sumter is the fort right here in the middle. It was surrounded by these other forts that used to be part of the Union that the Confederates took over, and from these forts they fired upon Fort Sumter. Most of the cannons for Fort Sumter fired out to sea, and so they weren't able to fight back very well because the fort was originally there to protect the city of Charleston that you see in the background. Now, Fort Sumter was about 3 stories tall. You can see here in this cutaway, whoops, we'll go back here so you can see the picture. Here's a cutaway, a drawing of Fort Sumter. I think this is from a postcard, actually. And you can see the inside where the cannons would have been. You can see what the inside of the fort looks like, and you can see how tall the fort would have been. Today, if you were to visit there, the fort is not near as tall as it was back then. There you can see a artist's sketch of Fort Sumter. And then here's what it looks like in the present. If you were to go to Fort Sumter, you can see the walls are not very tall. You can see the flagpole, which is still there. You can see they've built a visitor center kind of in the middle so you can look at artifacts and things. Some of the wall pieces are still, filled with cannonballs from the times that it was attacked during the Civil War. Okay. Well, after Fort Sumter surrenders, President Lincoln declares that the South is in rebellion, and he asks the state governors around the United States for 75,000 soldiers. States like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other states in the North rallied to bring troops. Minnesota was officially the first state to offer troops to fight in the Civil War because our governor, Alexander Ramsey, happened to be in Washington, D.C. when the day after Fort Sumter was attacked. He got in his carriage, drove to Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War's office, and offered the Minnesota troops to President Lincoln. So officially, Minnesota was the first regiment of troops for the Civil War. Now, when Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops, there are some other states in the South that had been thinking about leaving the Union, but hadn't yet. When they hear that Lincoln wants more troops or wants troops to attack in the South or to build up an army, these states leave the Union. So 4 more states leave the Union and become part of the Confederate States of America. Those states are North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas. Some of those states right above the first 7. So we have a total of 11 states now part of the Confederacy. There were some other states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri that were kind of wedged in between. To the north of them were free states, below them were Confederate states, and they were slave states, so they had slavery in those states, but they never joined the Confederacy. And the people in those states were divided about the war. President Lincoln worked very hard to try and keep these states from joining the Confederacy. His focus throughout the war was to keep these border states with the Union, especially Maryland. Maryland, if you look at a map, Washington, D.C. sits right in Maryland. And so if Maryland were to have fallen to the Confederacy, the capital of the United States would have been surrounded by a Confederate state. And President Lincoln did not want that to happen, so he worked very hard to keep the border states as part of the Union. There was a part of Virginia that wanted to stay with the Union, and there were enough people in there that by 1863, a new state was created called West Virginia. And so since 1863, we've had Virginia and West Virginia there. I believe this is a map. If you look at a map, you can see the green states are the Confederate states, the gold states are the Union states, and the blue states represent, and you can barely see Maryland and Delaware. They're located right here by where it says Washington, D.C. Those are all the border states. And so you can see where they are on the map. These are the first 7 to secede down here, and then Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia come later. Okay, here we're going to be talking about the advantages for the North and the South before the war, so make sure you remember this. This is part of your learning targets. The North had the advantage of a large population. They had a population of 22 million. Compare that to the South, which only had 5 million people. So the North had a very large advantage in the number of soldiers they could have and the number of people that could be working for the war effort. The North had the advantage of 22,000 miles of railroad track. That's an advantage because we could get supplies and troops to different places more quickly. And the North had a more developed economy, a more developed banking system, and money that actually had gold behind it. The South, on the other hand, their advantages were that the South had a very strong military tradition, that many of the best and brightest officers in the United States military were from the South. And so when the war breaks out, many of them choose to fight on the side of their home states or their home cities, and they decide to fight with the South. The Southerners also had the advantage of fighting on their home soil. So they knew where little hiding places were. They knew the quicker ways to get around that area. They knew the weather. All of those things provided an advantage to the South. So there were advantages for both sides as this war began. Let's talk about strategy. Both sides had a clear strategy. The Northern strategy was created by a general by the name of Winfield Scott. His name was Old Fuss and Feathers was his nickname. Here you can see a picture of him. He was a Mexican war hero. He was in 1848 when the United States was in the Mexican War. He was the main general during that time, and that's where he got his nickname. You can see his sideburns, and you can guess that he was probably a little grumpy being called Old Fuss and Feathers. He created a plan called the Anaconda Plan. And the Anaconda Plan for the North was to blockade, use the North ships to block off all of the southern ports so they couldn't get supplies in and out, capture the Mississippi River, which would then divide the South in half. And so it was called the Anaconda Plan because if you think of it as a little snake kind of going around the southern half, they were going to suffocate the South to where they couldn't fight the war anymore. Now the South had a very different strategy. The South didn't have to attack anywhere. The North had to make sure they had to go and attack and conquer the South, but the South didn't have to conquer the North. The South just had to hold on as long as it could. They only had to defend themselves until the North got tired of fighting them. The South also tried to get help from other countries, specifically France and Great Britain. And they used what was called cotton diplomacy to try and gain those countries to help them. Britain and France both had textile mills that used the cotton that came from the South. So the Southerners, the leaders, thought, hey, let's hold back the cotton so that France and Britain really, really want it really bad. And when they ask us for cotton, we'll just tell them we can't send it to you because we're fighting this war. Could you help us out? If you help us out, then we can probably get cotton to you. So it was called cotton diplomacy because they were using this cotton to try and get France and Britain involved in the war. This didn't work, and one of the reasons why it didn't work is because Britain and France started to get their cotton from other places, and they didn't need the Confederate cotton as much as was first believed. Okay, and then, of course, after Fort Sumter, these armies don't just all of a sudden start fighting battles. It takes time to train volunteer soldiers. So they needed armies, first of all, and those armies had to come from volunteers, people that said, hey, I'm going to go and I'm going to fight. Then those volunteers need to be trained. They need to be trained on how to march, how to shoot, how to use bayonets, all those types of things. And so it took some time before there was another major battle. Civilians, those people that couldn't go to war, they helped by raising money, running hospitals, serving as nurses, sending supplies to troops. Women would actually have sewing circles where they would sew flags or they sew socks. Then they would all be sent with the troops as they were sent off to war. Both armies faced shortages of clothing, food, and weapons throughout the war. Here's a picture of the two uniforms. Now, these uniforms really didn't start to take shape till about 2 or 3 years into the war. When the war first started, basically people just wore what they had. The Union soldiers had a regular uniform, but the Confederates, a lot of those soldiers just wore what they had when they got to the battlefield or when they volunteered. We're going to talk a little bit more about military strategy as we move forward. And so you'll get to find out why the war was so deadly and how the tactics actually led to a lot more of those deaths than there should have been. So let's go back here real quickly and take a look at our learning targets just to make sure that we covered them all. Okay, first, the North and South advantages before the war. We've got that. North had more population. North had more railroad tracks, had a better economy. The South had a strong military tradition, and they could fight on their own soil. So those were advantages for both North and South. Describe the North and South strategy. The North strategy was the Anaconda Plan, taking control of the Mississippi River, blocking the southern ports. That was created by a man named Winfield Scott. The South strategy was just to hold on as long as they could until the North got tired of fighting. And then also to use what was called cotton diplomacy, to hold back that cotton to try and get Britain and France involved. Major battles that we talked about in this section: Fort Sumter, the winners were Confederates, won that battle. And then the importance of people. We talked about a number of people during this section. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, P.G.T. Beauregard, the Confederate commander at Fort Sumter, Winfield Scott, the commander of the Union Army that created the strategy, and of course Abraham Lincoln. So we covered all those learning targets. If you need to replay this, please feel free to do so. If you need to pause it or go back to a place where you can write in some of your notes, please do that as well. If you have any questions, bring those to class with you and we'll talk about those in class. Thank you very much.